Thought I closed the door.
Welcome to day 2, our first quarterly deep dive series. If you didn't catch day 1 yesterday, our monthly deep dives have been so popular that we thought we'd brew up a higher gravity version. Ironic, since we're talking about about non-alcoholic beers here, but a 3-day version, once a quarter, to go even deeper around particular brewing subjects. Yesterday, we focused on recipe formulation. Tomorrow, we're going to focus on processing and food safety. This session you are tuned into now is going to focus on non-alcoholic fermentation. We're able to bring you these free live thanks to the support of our sponsors, which include Abstrax Hops, Fermentis, TechniBlend, Crafted ERP, Oktober Can Seamers, and PakTech. You can find more about each, as well as links to their websites, on our event landing page at beerandbrewing.com. Because it's a webinar, we are live and this is interactive. So if you are out there in the comments, and I see a bunch of them rolling in here, we have got folks tuned in from Wisconsin, upstate New York, Barcelona, Charlotte, Austria, Lille, France, Belgium, Lima, Peru, all over the world, all over the country, all over everywhere. Brewers are interested in this subject of non-alcoholic brewing. But as we go, Alaska again, we had Alaska yesterday as well. Anyway, as we go through, if something is not clear, go ahead and throw a comment out there in the comments, and I'll try to work that in. We'll also reserve some time at the end of the deep dive just for some general Q&A if there's any things we need to go into at a deeper level. But keeping this conversational and keeping this honest and direct and connected. Oh, Sweden's in the chat. All of that is really important, and that's one of the benefits of doing it in this kind of interactive format. So thank you to all the folks tuning in live wherever you are. Take advantage of that. Throw out those questions in the chat, and we will try to work it in. As I said yesterday, this is by no means a what you should do recipe for the one way to brew NA beer. There is not one way to make great NA beer. There are many ways to make great NA beer. And in fact, what you'll find is that a lot of brewers are using multiple methods of making great NA beer and trying to match the end goals for those beers to the processes that they use to make those beers. So we are trying to explore all of these avenues with real world opinions from brewers who've been working at it, testing and trying to find what works for them. Your mileage may vary. And again, this is supposed to be a jumping off and something that'll help you in your own process of developing what works for you in the way that you brew. We're going to get nerdy in this session. If you couldn't tell, we're going to talk about flavor pathways through fermentation. We're going to talk about arresting fermentation, using typical sac strains. We're going to talk about fermenting with maltose-negative yeasts. We're going to talk about how that biotransformative property of yeast can make or break NA beer. Dr. Peter Bircham's done quite a bit of work on that whole biotransformation thing. So we're going to talk about how yeast works and transforms flavor through this process and how that can impact your NA beer. But let's start off with a few quick introductions, and maybe we'll start off with you, Dr. Peter Bircham of Garage Project. Give us a good 60-second background and intro.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm not a brewer for start, so that's probably something.
You say you're not, but you do a fair amount of brewing, just at a very small scale.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very small scale. I'm a molecular biologist by background. Was working in fundamental biology, working with yeast the whole time, and was a home brewer. And gradually I've shifted that into more brewing science, mostly around yeast. Non-alcoholic yeast has been a big part of that. I did a lot of work in Belgium around that. I'm now based back home in Wellington, New Zealand, where I am the head of R&D for Garage Project, but also have an adjunct position at the university here. So we have a few students working on non-alcoholic yeast development programs. Yeah, just got a lot of funding in that space. So we're exploring developing novel yeast, looking for New Zealand yeast in that space, but also indigenous rights around native microorganisms and things like that. So it's quite a broad program we're working on there.
Like I said, we are going to get nerdy in this one. Jordan, chief brewer for Mash Gang.
I was already wanting to say, Pete, I mean, wasn't one of the, the keystones of modern non-alcoholic brewing was discovered in New Zealand, was it not? Is I'm going to pronounce it wrong. Pitcher
Yeah.
discovered on, we'll come round to that later, but that was a good segue.
Yeah, that was one of the early ones, New Zealand grapes, I think.
Beautiful. So I'm Jordan. I'm the chief brewer of Mash Gang. Started out in a bucket in my kitchen in 2020 during lockdown, and didn't get much more professional throughout my career. Once again, I kind of want to say I'm not really supposed to be a brewer either. I was supposed to handle the beverages for what was going to be a lifestyle brand. We were going to work on so many different things, but we got to the first thing, and when we got stuck on the first thing, we never stopped making the first thing. So now I oversee the breweries in the UK and the US, and I'm broadly responsible for all non-alcoholic beer-related liquids for my company.
Good stuff. Kevin Lane from Fermentis. Give us a little background on you, Kevin.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me, first of all. Let's see. I've been in the alcohol industries for, I don't know, close to 20 years now. I worked for a malting company a long time ago. At one point in my career, I was running the pilot brewery for Molson Coors, or what was called Miller Coors at the time. Running their pilot brewery, doing all experimental things every which way. I still retain that I'm a brewer because I still homebrew, even though it's a little bit less scientific these days. I joined Fermentis in 2013. I was in charge of sales for North America, but then around 2018, I switched to technical. So now I'm the senior technical sales support manager for North and South America for Fermentis on the yeast. And if we have time for it, we could talk a little bit about bacteria as well.
Bacteria. Okay. We might as well throw that into the mix, but maybe we'll start off with like just a general big broad question to kick off the conversation. We're talking about fermentation because without fermentation, we're just making hop water, right? And there's nothing wrong with hop water. I love hop water. I drink a significant amount of hop water. But if we're talking about a beer, then fermentation generally should be involved, and that's what it takes in order to give it that kind of perception of beer. So, maybe we start off in a broad sense, like when you're thinking about what you're trying to achieve with non-alcoholic fermentation, what are some of the kind of like chief sign points that you're looking for? I mean, when we're talking about a beverage that we're calling beer, a customer, somebody drinking it, is going to have a few kind of key points that they're going to latch onto to say, yeah, this tastes like beer, and not, oh, this tastes like hop water. Are there some, in terms of like ultimate intention, what are, are there a couple of the big things that you absolutely are trying to nail flavor wise, with fermentation itself? Maybe you can start on that one, Jordan.
I think the easiest version of this is going to be lager. So you don't have your hops to hide behind. You're not making a heavily fruited sour or something, and you're not doing a nitro stout where you can hide behind some body there. So with lager, you've kind of got all your bits hanging out, and it was the biggest challenge for us when we were starting was actually making a non-alcoholic lager that wasn't, breweries like Heineken, they can make a great lager and then remove the alcohol, but we couldn't even entertain that thought. The early versions were just they were so sulfurous and just nasty. And when we talk about the early days of Mash Gang pouring liters and liters and liters of beer down the drain, it was almost certainly lager I was talking about. But the one component that we hadn't factored in, and we should have all along because it's all the Germans ever talked about, was time. And we found that the effect of even the most minor fermentation, the effect of time on it in conditioning, was where we finally got to the point of making an actual serviceable alternative to a fully leaded light lager. That's where it came from. And I think when you look at what you're trying to replicate, it is probably you're trying to replicate all of the errors in an alcoholic beer. That's almost what craft beer is a lot of the time. It's a lot of artisan errors building up on purpose, but in a controlled way, but they are errors. And I think that's probably what you try and capture. That will be the beer experience, I think.
You're trying to capture the errors. Interesting. Well, because there's these modes, right? We have beer that is a product of the process, and I think for a lot of time, like when we looked at mixed culture beer, for example, just in a broad sense, there was a lot of process-driven mixed culture beer early, in the 2010s that wasn't great to drink, and it was a product of a process, and it did produce beer that tasted like this. And as a brewer, you could say, well, this is what it tastes like when I make it that way. But ultimately, if people don't want to drink that, then it's not really that useful, no matter how artful you want to think your natural process really is. And the true mastery started coming when we figured out how to take that natural process and manipulate more of the variables and massage that into something that we also want to drink and taste and consume in a greater quantity. And so I think, we have that question in NA beer now too. You can make NA beer that's a product of a certain process, but if it doesn't actually taste like the thing that we want to keep drinking, then have we been successful in that? Sure. Peters, you guys have set out with Garage Project. Have there been some kind of overarching goals in terms of flavor, or in terms of things that you now measure process against in order, we are successful if we are achieving these certain things as we go through this process of development?
I don't think we have specific metrics like that. I mean, flavor is the metric. The one thing we're after is, we're doing non-alcoholics. We don't want them to just be a non-alcoholic option. They've got to be big flavor. They've got to be as big as anything else. So, depending on what style it is, that's going to be a total different profile. I think from the more technical side, we're starting to look at things. We're measuring a lot more like thiols and terpenes in our finished beers and trying to see how they hold up. For some reason, our non-alcoholics actually hold up pretty well. I'd say they age better than most of our beers, which we're pretty surprised about. I'm not sure why that is.
I have some theories I'll share with you at some point, but I think it's to do with the more alcohol something has, the extraction's better earlier, but then it tapers off really quick. We would find that our extraction was rubbish, but it would last forever.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point, right? The dynamics of drinking a non-alcoholic are so different from an alcoholic beer. And so I guess the other metrics are really how do you get that drinking experience? Like you said, how do you remind yourself of beer with slightly different tools, right? Because you're missing the alcohol, which has got sweetness and mouthfeel. Because of that, all the off flavors are easier to pick up, and you're extracting less of what we think of as good flavors. So the balance is totally different. And I think it's just what tools have you got with the yeast or the process you're using to try and remind you of those things without trying to mimic explicitly your alcoholic version. Because if you're going for a one-for-one mimic, you're not going to get there. But if you try and get something that brings all those perceptions to you, then you're going to have a good beer.
Jordan, when you say that that extraction is less efficient without alcohol, have you found in a practical sense that is actually true? Because I've had differing opinions from brewers on we're talking about a generally weak alcohol solution anyway. Even your strongest beer is still 10%.
It's barely even, it's a rounding error in everyone else's work, and that's part of the job, is that you live on a different decimal point to everyone else. But yeah, definitely one of the most surprising things was when we were in Northern Monks Brewery in Leeds, when we had access to them sharing with us exactly how they were making and dry hopping grocery store IPAs, which is what we're trying to get, that kind of everyone kind of loves it flavor. You know, that an NA market was a fraction of the craft beer market back then, which is funnier now than it should be. But if we 1-to-1 took their dry hopping schedule, the beer would be barely, it would have no robustness and complexity from the hops. It would be completely one-dimensional, and that was one of the first bits that we struggled to overcome. Of course, now the easiest route, you mentioned Abstrax earlier, really one of the things is hop oils muddy the water because they kind of already been through that sort of process. If we're talking back then, when it's all sort of T90 pellets and stuff, but now not so much, just because we're using a lot more liquids. And I don't mean just Mash Gang or Dione Life or the NA industry. I mean everyone in beer is using a lot more liquids, in my opinion.
That's 100%. Yeah.
Sorry. I think that's a good point too, because when it comes to fermenting an NA beer, early, probably maybe 2018, 2017, somewhere around there, we started really getting into NA beer and going through the process of trying to identify a maltose-negative strain, have the right profile. Beyond that, you almost have to reteach yourself brewing, because it's not the same process. You know, whether it's hop extraction or time in fermentation, those are completely different than what your typical beer would be.
Totally.
Yeah. For me, it was kind of eye-opening that, like, we had very professional laboratories that were doing trial work, and they were doing it completely wrong. I'm not going to call out any names, but it was really just kind of a copy and paste from making beer to making NA beer. And that's where it went wrong, was you can't treat it the same. It's a very different product. And you have to really learn or relearn how to brew specifically for that process.
Almost like a worldwide experiment now. Like no one 100% knows what they're doing, and we're all trying something different.
I always think of it like mixing music. I don't know if you guys ever got really interested in that, but you know, if you were mixing a band that didn't have a singer, you'd have to write music in a completely different, a more vocally musical way. So I feel like a lot of my job wasn't so much, you know, it was filling in all of the gaps that were left. So when you have a fermentation, even if it's a simple and elegant Czech beer or something that just has a handful of grains, you know, and it's pretty Reinheitsgebot, you know, that is not a one-dimensional beer. But we would find that we'd had these holes, and you've mentioned them: mouthfeel, sweetness, or just broadly shrugging your shoulders and going, but it doesn't go anywhere. It just stops in my mouth. You know, it has no longevity. It has no depth. And those were the challenges that we were working with. And that's why we were messing around with so many different types of yeast, because they were one of the only levers that we could pull to make any changes. We were highly restricted in the grain that we can use, because anything that's too sugary goes off straight away and you overshoot. So you can see how all those things compound, but they're easy to solve if you just stop trying to be a brewer for a minute and start thinking about how everyone else in the, you know, fast moving consumer goods world works. A whole product.
Yeah, yesterday we talked quite a bit about using very high fermentation temperatures to create not sweet, but also on less fermentable, kind of wort, so that you can retain some body that still doesn't present as this kind of sugary or fermentable thing, and get to that just, bone dry attenuation. But that's a nice segue into the subject of fermentation itself. Let's talk about some of the, the major modes of fermentation, for non-alcoholic beer in a general sense. We've talked about it just a little bit here, of using, yeast, maltose-negative yeast that will not produce alcohol. That is one popular method. Another method is using typical Saccharomyces cerevisiae and stopping fermentation before that yeast gets into its alcohol production phase. And then, of course, the third method, which we're not really going to talk about here, but we will talk about on tomorrow's session, is fully fermenting with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, fully fermenting an alcoholic beer, and then using membrane filtration to remove that alcohol. And so all of these methods are viable methods that different brewers use depending on what their goals are. But in this, specifically in the non-alcoholic, non-alcohol producing yeast space, describe the kind of like, what that universe looks like. Maybe Kevin, you can, just kind of like, map it out for us, what the various organisms are that we can use that'll ferment, but without producing alcohol.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot. Surprisingly, there aren't too many yeast strains that can handle ethanol, at least in significant concentration. So, when you look at, I'll kind of reference a different industry for a second, but when you look at wine fermentation, there's so much natural flora that's present in the vineyard that comes with the grapes, because there's really no sterilizing point or sanitizing point in winemaking. So you have this plethora of wild, what I'll call wild yeast, but I mean, it's bigger than just diastaticus or whatever you want to call it. But so many of those are only ethanol tolerant to 0.5, 1%, maybe 1.5 or 2%. And then after that, they die off because they just can't withstand that environment. When you look at historically how NA beer was made, there were different methods, of course. You mentioned some of them. There's cold contact, where you're putting, and this was when I was young and they were making NA beer, and it was just cold contact. So it was freezing cold wort, lager yeast, Pastorianus, let it be in contact for some time, and then process the beer, which in that case, you don't really have any fermentation character. You're just putting yeast in a liquid slurry or liquid media, and it's not able to do anything because it's just too cold. I'm glad that those days are behind us because those beers were not good. Much more worty, kind of old wort that smells or tastes like tomato soup type flavors. What we're looking at now is really, there are Saccharomyces cerevisiae that are maltose-negative. We have one in our portfolio, but then we're also looking at other species. So Torulaspora, Pichia, Zygosac. I mean, there's just a number that you can find in references, literature-based. And I think the important thing with any of those is you do carry out some fermentation. And why that's important is because when you taste beer, you recognize malt character, you recognize hop character, but you also recognize fermentation. Mm-hmm. And I think something that's a bit misunderstood is that even if the ester profile or hierarchical profile isn't to threshold, you still appreciate it. So you can't necessarily call out one specific compound. You can't say that's isoamyl acetate, that's ethyl hexanoate, but because they're all present and in a similar ratio in that non-alcoholic beer, that's where you get the appreciation of, oh, this tastes like a beer. And I think furthermore, there was a question I saw managing hop creep in NA beers, and I'm not going to talk about that, but I think something that's also interesting to know and understand is having diacetyl, having 2,3-butane 2,3-pentane present in the beer, even though it's a negative flavor, unless you're Harry Potter, it's a negative flavor, but having some present, again, relates back to a fermentation. So just because it's there doesn't mean it's a bad thing. If it's there and it's not overwhelming, we're not going to talk about butter beer here, but as long as it's present in some respect, you get more of that appreciation of a fermented beer, of a fermented beverage. And I think that's where sometimes the line is difficult, especially when we're talking about NA beer, because you can't, even though we all want to believe that you go off of the same metrics for chemical analysis, it's completely different. Even pasteurization of an NA beer is different because the media you're starting out with is not an alcoholic solution. So I don't know if that answered your question. I mean,
Sure.
the gates are wide open for different micro. I think what it ends up coming down to is what's working, and more so what's specifically working for the beer you're trying to target. For sure, there's going to be some yeasts that work better for general purpose, but I think in general, you're going to have to make selections of yeast strains similar to the alcoholic versions, where you select this strain for your IPAs, this strain for your Pilsners, and so on, where you're not just using one strain across the board. Of course, you can do that, but it's not going to be the same. And especially in craft beer, where there's so much focus on flavor and differentiation and enjoyment in that character, that you have to look outside of the normal box for the most part. I'm not saying, again, you can't do it within standard Saccharomyces, but for the most part, you have to look outside the box and say, okay, what is my target? What is my end goal with this beer? What do I want? And then kind of work backwards from there to build it up.
For a moment there, I thought we were going to start a beef with the entire country of Czechia, but
we're talking about Pilsner as well, aren't we? I went to go. That was just something I didn't want to build up straight away, but I was going to say, when I was talking about my job was often finding the mistakes to replicate for accuracy, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And can you imagine? Yeah, I am looking at those kind of off notes, the little pear drop notes, little banana notes, even little tomato notes, and actually building those in to be as a panel of flavors, like you would if you were Tropicana modifying your orange juice for market consistency. That's what I was doing even 4 years ago. So it's the way I would suggest to do it.
Sure. I think New Belgium has a good way of talking about this, and they don't talk about off flavors. They talk about attributes, and those attributes can become off flavors or be perceived as off flavors when they hit certain thresholds. For us, it's kind of the problem of when we judge beer with professional brewers. They're flaw hunting because they're so trained in their own beer to find the smallest flaw and try to, but that also makes it kind of hard to find that je ne sais quoi, the gestalt of all of it coming together, because some of those things can exist in small ways. They don't distract you from the beer. They can actually add to it. And when they reach that level of a certain threshold or a threshold for enough people, then they can be perceived as those kinds of off flavors. And I think that that's a fair way to look at it. But I think what you're saying is right. You call it a bunch of flaws, together, but that's what all of these things are, right?
Oh, of course. It's why you care about getting a sourdough loaf of bread versus a white sliced box loaf. I think humans, as you get to the end of the things that they like the most or treat themselves or a luxury, their exercises in extreme amounts of flavors and balances pulling in different directions. That's kind of like what really sets your brain on fire. So that's the kind of thing you're trying to fit. And earlier on, Pete's talking, to that as well. That's what is it that I'm trying to make the customer feel? What am I trying to make them do? I can't bribe them with alcohol, so I can't drug my customer now. That sucks because I accept bribes, and it's like, without that, how do I step up? And the answer always for us was, we just have to have more of everything. Like, more is more. If you love minimalism, wait until you get a load of me. I got loads of it. It's
sure. Peter,
that's how I did it.
Yeah, Peter, let's talk a little bit about some of the actual flavor transformation, some of the ways that the yeasts, in particular these non-alcoholic yeasts, across the spectrum, work to transform these kinds of components, whether that's things that we are generating through that hot side process. Some of the ways that they transform these kinds of flavor, chemical components into the things that we then associate with beer. Talk about some of how those things work and what some of those kind of key things are that we then signify as beer.
Yeah, I mean, as Kevin said, there's a whole lot of non-conventional yeast that you can pick from. If we talk about them just broadly versus sack yeast, they tend to have quite different properties. Like sack yeast tend to be a bit cleaner. They're often more subdued with the fermentation. I think on a non-alcoholic because it's so restricted. And with the non-sack yeast, they often have quite weird properties. You know, if you brew them to full alcohol, some of them are pretty damn extreme. But that does mean we can play with some of these flavors. You know, some of them produce a lot more esters, and you don't need a really high amount of a single one. Chemical classes often act synergistically. So you might have a bunch of esters below threshold, but together they are above threshold, and they give you that impression. Same with terpenes or thiols or whatever compound you're looking at. So that's always kind of interesting. Because your fermentation's so restricted on this, you've got to try and get as much as possible with that limited amount. And part of that's that flavor production. If you've got more esters and higher alcohols, these are also masking some of the wordy off flavors. I'm really questioning now how much yeast reducing aldehydes is the bigger factor versus what's else produced that's masking these flavors. And it's a
What's
combination of
masking?
these things. Yeah. And
Yeah.
you do need to reduce some aldehydes and get rid of the wordy flavor. That's extremely hard with any of these yeasts. Some are better than others in the non-alcoholic, but if you can do a little bit of that and then produce some of these esters or higher alcohols or whatever else, that can help balance that.
Peter,
Again,
explain that to me. When you say reducing these aldehydes or masking these aldehydes, what do you mean by that? You think this wordy flavor that we
these
perceive
wordy
in
flavors
some
that,
NA is connected to these aldehydes?
yeah, most of what people call wordy flavor has been attributed to aldehydes. I'm not sure that's the only thing contributing to these, but that's what everyone's focusing on at the moment. When yeast are fermenting, the same genes that are dealing with alcohol are also actually reducing these aldehydes into alcohol forms, which are less aromatic. So you notice these off flavors less, or these wordy flavors less. And then when you're restricting fermentation, you're restricting that as well. And the other bit that we're missing is alcohol. Alcohol is a solvent, right? So because you're at a really low level, the flavor threshold for all of these things has gone up. So a little bit of aldehyde is suddenly a lot of aldehyde aroma. Same with esters or higher alcohol. So a little bit of them is suddenly a lot more. So yeah, you're trying to balance that with the tools that you've got. Again, balancing it with hops and hop products, biotransformation, which we've typically been talking about, terpene release or thiol release, is also very, very tricky with these fermentations because it's such a small amount of fermentation, right? So I think, again, some of the non-conventional ones are probably more potent at these kind of transformations. So if you want something that's going to be like a bigger, fruitier, more tropical, maybe they're a better way to go. If you want a cleaner lager like a profile, they're probably the wrong thing. They're going to be too estery, too fruity.
In that sense, we can look at downstream, additions rather than looking at it from this kind of, upstream process. Well, let's then talk let's, start talking about some of the nuts and bolts of non-alcoholic fermentation. And maybe we start with, some of the challenges and also benefits of fermenting with some of these non-alcohol producing yeasts. Jordan, you've done some experiments with those, and Peter, you have too. Talk about how that fermentation differs a bit from a typical sack fermentation, and how you found in testing some of these, what has generally worked and what have you found that really didn't work?
Well, it's like raising a baby, really. Like a lot of the time when you're using sack yeast, you don't have to get up in the middle of the night. But we found that Pikia tended to suddenly wake up at exactly the moment you didn't want to do it. So to bring into focus how ridiculous we had to be, we were running telemetry 24 hours a day on the tank, and we'd have alarms set on a 4G network on our phone. And if it got to a threshold, you had to get up, go to the brewery and go and cold crash the tank. Everyone's face when you said, and they can smell quite strong if they keep going. I mean, the ones that we made under duress, they smelt like a cross between very ripe peaches and almost rotting pineapple levels of fruitiness. In the end, we actually started making a 2% base with that stuff that was so strong that we could liquor it back to 0.5%. And it was still too strong, but it was excellent. It was really, really good. It was just fit. We had to keep an oxygen feed on it, and we really had to keep it in this Goldilocks zone. Otherwise, the off notes would just be horrendous. Mostly sulfurous, sort of like eggy, horrible, cabbagey notes would come out of nowhere. But we were running several tanks in concurrently with different mixes and just trying to work out how the best way of doing it was. I'm going to be honest and say we never actually found the best way of doing it. But what I would say is we found loads of really, really, really promising ways. But this is where non-alcoholic brewing sometimes just goes out of the window. We had the cans go to Heineken to pasteurize them for us. And they ran them through their, what we calculated would be correct for all of this, given all of the expertise of about 5 or 6 different people. And then we went a little bit safer and all of them failed. This yeast was way more resilient, and in the can it got hold of the sugar again, and we even started just pasteurizing it over and over again to see what would happen. But inevitably it would come back to life at some point, and it was completely and utterly unusable. When you're at the reason that, you know, the most popular yeasts of all time have endured in civilization is because they're easier to use than this. So that's the answer. You're going to have to, I don't want to swear on this, but you're going to work for it. You're really going to work for it.
And time is so different in these kind of fermentations. You can do them very short and get one profile. You can leave them a little bit longer and it changes again. Some of them will produce, you know, crazy high amounts of, say, a higher alcohol like isoamyl alcohol, and then that will gradually shift to isoamyl acetate, which is then stronger in flavor. So what's your timing? And if you're going to pasteurize these, it's not like you have to finish beer the same way necessarily. You can choose your timing a little bit more than otherwise. It's I think, you know, we talk about these different species, like there's one picky or there's one, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, of course.
And like, how many different beer strains are there that are all the same species, right?
Yeah.
It's the same with all of these as well. So people are still trying to find the right one, or, you know, ones with different properties. I mean, these sulfury, cabbagey, eggy notes we struggle with. If the ferment goes a little bit wrong, it's suddenly a major problem. So you really, really got to pay attention. If something stalls in the middle of the night, it probably will be a problem. And then trying to deal with that. So they're not necessarily tricky, but if things go wrong, they can go a lot more wrong very quickly compared to a normal beer, I would say.
The payback, of course, is some of what they create in isolation is without a doubt the most authentic representation of the taste of alcohol that you could get. And the most success we had is we were running a load of tests at the same time, and one of the IPAs was running into micro IPA territory. It hit 1.2%, and at that point we just wanted to see where it would keep going, because it was obviously the calculations were so far wrong. But that was using a standard sack yeast strain. Of course, we had these other tanks that had, you know, peach disaster and pineapple mayhem going on in them, and we ended up blending all of the, because these guys, some of them were hovering around 0.03%. They were generating very little amounts of ethanol and just about everything else. And we blended those down. And I remember looking at the pint, and it looked like something from Other Half. It was completely opaque. It was orange. It glowed in the dark, and the head was fluffy on it. I took a sip, and I'll send a picture to you guys so you can see it. And I thought, I am going to be so freaking rich. And we never got this beer to work. It would just continually fail. You couldn't can it. It would fob like crazy. But when it was in that jug out of a little pigtail, God, it was about as close to it ever getting. I've made a double IPA that's under basically no alcohol. But that's what I chase.
Kevin, when it comes to non-alcoholic fermentation, obviously Fermentis scientists have worked on this problem and gone through lots of trials, because if you're going to bring a product to market, you're going to test all of the things that all the ways you could go before you find a route. Talk about some of that kind of process and maybe some of the dead ends and what some of the kind of non-compromise pieces are in and where you all ended up.
That's a great question. And kind of along with these guys, we made mistakes, certainly. We found different non-sac that in the initial trial were so off-putting, whether that was elevated levels of isoamyl acetate or really that worty kind of character, that they weren't our first release, but now we're reinvestigating and looking at them again and saying, okay, maybe our process at the beginning wasn't right. We've also gone as far as to do really hot temperature mashing, where to reach this mashing temperature, you have to be boiling water first because of the temperature drop mixing with grain. Where you're just really producing a non-fermentable wort. I mentioned it earlier. We found, interestingly enough, that doing a kettle sour had some interesting volatile flavor profile that related it more to beer. Not that it tasted like beer, but having that acidity present, maybe some of the flavors from the bacteria present, that then when you ferment with a maltose-negative strain, you end up with a product that I wouldn't say it tastes like an alcoholic beer, but is more similar, and probably because of the acidity of it, maybe that additional fermentation from the bacteria side. But then we've gone as far as to really challenge pasteurization, because if you look in the EBC, their recommended pasteurization level, I believe, is 80 to 120 pasteurization units. Jordan, for your Heineken experiment, those are usually like 10 to 15, maybe.
Yeah, I think I may have found the error. I think it was 30. I think we actually went with 30 to 6, and I think it was 30 initially, and then I said no, like we should put it to 60. I have 60 in my head, and so I don't think so. It still wasn't enough, and that is exactly why it wasn't enough.
Yeah, no, we did a trial within Fermentis. We know, not me, but they know the thermotolerance of all of our yeast strains. So they took the most thermotolerant from our beer portfolio, purposely inoculated an NA beer, and then we ran pasteurization trials on that. And in that process, we found that 50 pasteurization units was enough on a traditional pasteurizer, but with an asterisk that we were only testing our own yeast strains from our portfolio. So could there be something else that's more thermotolerant? For sure. I mean, for sure there is somewhere.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's going to get into your brewery, that's another question. But
it's really out of the gate. I mean, when we the second phase of what we were doing was really the trying to get every sugar out. We were using all the kind of like the Norwegian farmhouse yeast, and we were fermenting at 40 degrees centigrade so that we just absolutely bricked the sugar floor in there. And then we would sort of refill it with non-fermentable sugars. At first it was lactose, but then no one really likes that, so we moved on to maltodextrin. And then we went through like a maltodextrin addiction phase where we basically caused a shortage in the UK because I've got a note here and I've converted it to, it may not be right because I've used AI to convert it. I would not work, but I just tried to do it quite now. It was 1,000 kilos of maltodextrin in a 70 hectoliter run, which is about 37 pounds of maltodextrin per barrel. Was the upper limit we discovered that you could put in it before it started to become solid. But bear in mind, when I'm discussing all of these like processes we just talked about, these weren't things we were planning on selling ever. This was using the British government's very generous R&D tax credits service to really, the point of it, I joke like we were messing around, but we really thought that this was in 2022. It was like, this is the year that we're going to break it, and we wanted to go all of the way to kind of, we were doing loads of beer festivals and stuff, so we really wanted to stand up to our peers and the guys that we really looked up to, and we wanted to be taken seriously by. So we probably shouldn't have been putting all that maltodextrin in it. But that's what we were doing back then, because you try everything and you're desperate for it to work.
And I mean, I think that's part of it. It's a learning process still to this day. You know, we have historical information from the industrial players around the world, but that was really focusing more on lager, specifically trying to fit their bill. And these days, there's a variety of NA beer on the shelf, from IPAs to golden ales to stouts or porters. I mean, there's everything. And I think what you're talking about is really that investigation. Like, how can we do this? How can we make something that's palatable, first of all, and that somebody enjoys, right?
Yeah,
I think
a big part of that as well. I was just going to say, using maltodextrin and things like this is, with traditional recipe building, you've kind of got an idea of how they're going to play out in a beer, but here, these yeasts all behave differently with these ingredients. So, you've got to reassess these. And if you don't like something in your finished beer, you figure out what ingredient that came from and try adjusting that. Yeah.
Have there been any interesting yeast ingredient interactions that you found in any of your testing, Peter, that are illustrative?
I think the most obvious one is aldehydes, right? Like, if you got wordy aldehydes, they're coming from the malt. So, play around with different malt to see what works for you. I don't know about ingredients specifically, but looking at the yeast, I guess Jordan's approach compared to Garage Project's approach is quite opposite, where we've basically spent the last few years trying to get to know our yeast perfectly and understand how it works as our approach to, so that we can design recipes and have an idea of how they're going to come out. Whereas the other approach is, explore all the diversity and make use of the different flavors that you can, but it's gonna be changing all the time. Make the use of it in a different way. So, kind of depends on your approach. One thing I keep telling people is,
that also was the wide end of the funnel. I mean, when I'm talking about these things on these kind of calls, really it's more about the process of how I got to where I am now is probably as useful for everyone as right now. If I talk about the last 24 months of work, I've just been working on one draft beer. Like, that's it. That's all I've done for nearly 2 years, is working on one draft beer. Because draft NA beer is nothing like NA beer.
It's the challenge, right?
And it's so when my business was acquired and my new boss said, what do you think the biggest challenge you ever have will be in this? And I went, making a draft beer and getting it everywhere. And he said, that was it. That's what I got. And now that was pretty much all I did. Obviously you go through continuous improvement. We're always doing our sort of Six Sigma and lean manufacturing stuff, but everything's more about focusing now on kind of, I'm looking at marginal gains now. I'm looking at things like value engineering products, because I have a theory that the NA space actually needs products that cost less money and are better. So I'm looking at 70% of the best experience NA product ever, but I want to receive it at 30 to 50% of the cost of that one. And that's where I think that I want to live. And it's all well and good, us all talking about the dream, the flavor, the experience, but what also about an industry that needs to make more money for the industry itself. To sustain this growth, this research and development will come at a cost. So I feel like we have a responsibility to diversify our products, both from things that are highly experimental, which is where I was at, to things more like you're doing, where it's like, we need to have a range of these things, experimental and a good deal for the end customer. It's not very sexy, is it?
Let's speaking of longevity and safety in package, I want to circle back to this acidity question because I thought that was an interesting one, and I don't know that we explored it enough. And I do eventually want to get to arrested fermentation and some of the functionality behind that. But Kevin, you mentioned that in this kind of, I assume it's lactobacillus, that's acid producing, but
Yeah.
that this kind of, in a normal, like say a kettle sour process, that lactobacillus generation and dropping that pH actually did have some flavor effect that then created some precursors or whatnot that helped adjust and make that taste more like an actual acidic or Berliner Weiss or lacto fermented beer.
Yeah. So we have two bacteria currently for kettle souring. The one that we found more interesting was Lactobacillus plantarum, and that on its own has really like a lemony citrus flavor from that lactic souring. And one of the challenges I think that we faced initially was that our first release for NA beer production is a POF positive strain. Whether you like it or not, it's POF positive, right? So we were looking at different ways to manage or mitigate that phenolic character. And one of the ways that we found was doing kettle souring, that the bacteria obviously converted the precursors, the 4-vinyl glycol precursors, and it might have been volatilized partially, we're not sure, but really the ferulic acid and picoumeric acid, which are going to be your usual suspects for phenolic character in beer, at least. There's other cinnamic acids that can be converted to phenols as well, but those are the two in beer. And it was a combination of kettle souring and then fermenting with our first option for the NA beer market that turned out this beer that was pleasant. I mean, it wasn't offensive in any way. It wasn't mouth-puckeringly sour. It did slightly reduce the ethanol production because the bacteria is also working on simple sugars, so it's not, you don't have all that available for the yeast later on. But it was really just this really interesting balance of kind of citrusy lemon type background with the fermentation profile or volatile profile of our first non-alcoholic strain. That, again, I can't say that it tastes like beer, like an alcoholic beer, but it certainly appealed to kind of that fruity, citrusy note in combination with esters and higher alcohols from the yeast strain itself. That it was a very pleasant beverage. I'll say that it's a pleasant beverage.
I would say, like, all around for non-alcoholics, because you've got that higher residual sugar.
Yeah.
The acid profile at the end is far more important, and you need that to bring back a bit of freshness, right?
Well, absolutely.
I never go over 4, even apart from stouts.
That's also a food safety standard, is to drop below 4. There's different numbers that people throw out: 4.6, 4.2, 4.0, and that's, when we came to that discussion, for me, it reminded me of, like, I don't know if you've ever experienced safety trainings where they say, okay, safety is like stacking up layers of Swiss cheese. There's holes in each of them, but if you stack enough of them, you can't see through anymore. So, it's kind of one of those things that we had the benefit that it dropped the pH. We had the acidity present, which beer is slightly more acidic. And you had that flavor profile that worked well. I mean, it was a nice balance. And I think that's, we've said it a few times, each of us, balance. And I think that's one thing that you always have to focus on, is balancing your beer, whether it's alcoholic or not. I mean, I remember the earlier days of craft beer where it was like the bitterness challenge. Who could get the most bitterness?
1 million IBU.
Yeah. Or, when was it? It was probably in like the early teens when it was the absolute maximum amount of ethanol you could get to and still call it a beer.
I went to the GBBF. It's still like that to a degree there, which is great. It was like a time capsule. Yeah, I mean, to that end, I mean the Philly sour stuff, the thermotolerant, we were
Yeah.
using that early as simply as a sugar reduction tool. So that was like the pre-fermentation bit, and we were actually trying. I mean, we're saying you pretty much try everything. We're trying to like base adjust it back, so we're like adding loads and loads of salts and things, and it was you try it. The science kind of made sense, but no, it wasn't very nice. But but it did lead to something. It was showing us every time that basically whatever the style of beer, if it was NA, it would need to be slightly more acidic to add sparkle, if that's, and it also kind of adds a little bit of bite that kind of keeps this sessionability. And once again, it's like Peter said, it's not an alcohol kind of thing, but it maybe sits in the same kind of experience category. I would say things like that are, if you did a shot of ginger or wasabi, they have the same interruptive moment that a shot of scotch does. That first shot of scotch goes, "Ah," that feeling is what I try and explain to people that I'm trying to get. That's why when you're looking at the bills for my early lagers, it's got Szechuan peppercorns in the boil, and I was making like quite tannic teas with Chardonnay oak because I'm trying to malic acid, citric acid, lactic acid, acetic acid, and trying to get some kind of complexity in there. I'm cheating fermentation, I guess.
No, but I mean, it's using what's available. I mean, I think that's,
Yeah.
You've talked about that quite a bit, is using what's available, what's around that you can. No, I think it's a great experiment. I think that's the road that we're headed down right now with craft beer and with NA beer, is that fortunately people are still willing to experiment and to see,
Yeah.
if I combine this, which is somewhat similar to the experience of that, can I kind of make that connection, that perception on the palate, and relate more to the alcoholic beers of the world?
Yeah. Can I fool you for a second? That's it. Can I distract you for longer? That's it. Can I keep your attention for a moment? That's all the product is. Or it's utilitarian, and if it's Bud Light or Coors Light or Miller Light, it gets my throat from being dry to being wet. That's the kind of thing. But we're supposed to produce, the guys on this call at least are supposed to produce experiences and moments for people, which is corny as fuck, but it's probably the only reason you still get up in the morning.
I mean, that's our whole approach with Tiny, is it's flavor first, and what that flavor is and how you run with it doesn't matter as much, but it's flavor first.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Are there any mash peculiarities when using these non-alcohol producing yeasts in terms of how you manage acidity through that mash? Someone mentioned acidulated malt through this, but it just raised that question. Is there what you need to achieve for conversion is not really functionally based here as much as flavor based. And so, is there anything to the way that those non-alcohol producing yeasts, what ranges they work in that might be different, for brewing with them?
I mean, the tricky bit is that they probably all behave very differently. I mean, I think the easiest, easiest bit of advice.
Check with the source of that.
You're trying to do it wrong anyway.
Yeah.
Like whatever everyone else. Part of my job was like, I said, well, if someone's making a double IPA, how do I make like a half an IPA? Like, should I start there and go that way? Like, and at every step, when someone did it better and made it more efficient, I just do the opposite. So it's not that hard. I'm not that smart.
Yeah, don't take the approach of like, what's the right way to do this? Choose one method, choose one yeast, do something with it, decide what's wrong, and then say, okay, how can I do this? What acid would give it a better flavor here? What malt would give it a better profile? What hop is standing out in an awkward way, and I'm going to swap it out? but just choose one and then stick with it for a little bit. You know, get to know it. There's not going to be a perfect yeast or a perfect recipe or whatever. You got to just learn something about it.
Does that figure into your creative process, Peter? Because if you're thinking about what acid could this could use more malic acid. This could use more citric acid to bring out this. You know, you can then obviously add your food grade acid addition, test it all out, and then you could even basically reverse engineer a process that may be more craft focused to do all of that. So that it then naturally produces that rather than having to do it through chemical additions. Does that figure into the process?
Yeah, we'll sit there and we might have a beer recipe that we're trying, and like it's a little bit flabby. How do we bring this up? And we just try all of them to say what you want. Do you want flavor in there? Citric's going to bring a lot of flavor, or lactic's going to be a different flavor. Do you not want flavor, but you want the lower acidity? Probably phosphoric's going to be really neutral, or adjust it upstream.
I think that's a good thing. A good thing to note too is that there isn't a wrong time, in my opinion, to add acid to the wort, to the beer, to adjust it to the right spot, and you'll have different outcomes depending on when you do it. If you're doing it hot side, if you're doing it post fermentation, whatever. I think obviously for safety reasons, there's an important need to drop the pH with some acid. But we have customers that are doing it hot side. We have customers that are doing it post fermentation to hit the number that they want. And I think any of those is valid in my opinion. Just don't expect the same outcome every way you do it. Or even for that matter, across different types of beer. You're going to have a different media going from a lager to a stout to an IPA. And based on what's present in the media, you have to adjust accordingly.
Should we talk a little bit about arrested fermentation? We're at a little over an hour now, and so want to just kind of cover this before we drop into some general questions. And I think Jordan, as you and I have talked before, there's not necessarily one method that you use for all of your NA beers. You brew dark NA beers, you brew hoppy NA beers, you brew lager adjacent NA beers, and so you'll often vary the kind of technique or the way that that you're producing this, in a way that suits the ultimate beer style that you're trying to make. So in this kind of arrested fermentation, are there particular beer styles you find lend themselves to using sack yeast and that need to go through this kind of process? And then if you were pursuing arrested fermentation, talk about some of the process around that.
I think in my experience at the arrested fermentation, the two that are absolutely fine every single time, generally hazy IPAs and also any kind of like sour, they're like fine. The ones where it shows up badly in my experience have been stouts and lagers. So those normally just get written out. A stout always calls for kind of like a low attenuating yeast, in my opinion, anyway. So you can push that off to the side. But it's one of the ones where I think with your IPAs, specifically your East Coast, you've got quite a big flavor pack to work with. You've got quite a lot of arrows in your quiver, so to speak. So you don't have to worry so much about that. And also, I don't mind a little bit of malt, and I don't mind a little bit of wort in my IPAs, actually. Some of my favorites still kind of drag that kind of early 2000s malt bill in with the door with them. Bell's definitely does. I love a little bit of that. So I'd say it's not my favorite way to do it, arresting fermentation. I think that's a hangover from a belt and braces approach to quality. When you're so worried that you can't afford a bad batch, you tend to really over egg the cake, and we do somewhat. And I always felt like leaving something half done felt quite dangerous. If you've got tunnel pasteurization, you have the controls that we have in place at the facilities we use now. Of course you can do it, churning out millions of cans. It's far easier to do. but it's not really a process I use much. But I would sort of urge breweries to at least try it. You know, if you have the equipment to do it. Something we've not talked about, but which is quite adjacent to that, is higher gravity brewing and splitting down. I don't know if you guys have ever played with that. Is there any value in talking about that of interest? So
Absolutely.
it's really just how the Brits used to ship beer to India, really. You know, we'd make a higher gravity beer and it's supposed to be watered down a bit, but then they just didn't. In this instance, I'm just talking about brewing a beer that's going to be 1 or 2% and you're going to cut it back by a factor. One of the things that we looked at initially is it does feel very dirty to be liquoring back a 50% plus liquor back feels weird. But there are certain beers, and I do think that if you actually liquor back a lager that has been made quite aggressively of a very, very robust flavor profile. Do you remember when I said like conditioning was doing a lot of the heavy lift on the flavor? We found if we made quite a big, you know, industrial lager, cut it back by 50% or more, then conditioned it. And we were having to put a light dry hop in it, and we were having to add some stuff to pad out the body a bit, some oak extracts we had in there actually for tannins and complexity, and some, I think it was actually walnut shell extract as well at some point as well.
Oh.
Does that sound familiar? I think it was that actually. And all of those things came together. We didn't have the idea ourselves. We'd heard that big German producers, that's how they used to make their alcohol-free beers, is they just liquor back a very, very, very strong tasting wheat beer. And even if it wasn't true and it was just bro science or mythology, hey, it gave us the idea to try it, and it did work.
I challenge you to use the word blending instead of diluting or watering back.
Yeah,
That's
I
how
know,
you talk about
but-
it in a more romantic way. Is blending
But
to stack.
the thing is that you guys know me, right? Is that everything I've ever done in my business is like, it's really transparent. Like I always drove to make sure that I was doing what I was supposed to be doing, and I think that when I think about like, you know, blending scotch and stuff, I don't think about blending it with Milwaukee City Water. But yeah,
I think it's the other bit you're giving the yeast a chance to do is biotransformation stuff, right? So,
yeah,
like when you're just fermenting to, you know, below 0.5, it's so little time for them
hard.
to do something, and here you're giving them that chance, even though it's going to be the same in the same percent in the outcome. You're giving them that chance to actually do the fermentation.
And I think that's, you know, if you're talking to people that are sort of home brewing or they're starting to scale things up, it's like, you know, you can be bold enough to brew up half a, you know, small tank and ditch half of it, and then, you know, blend it, try it.
I also saw there was a question in there about home brewing and what used to do. I would probably avoid it, to be honest. Definitely get your cash low. This would be a way safer way to do it.
It was horrible.
Right? Yeah, but
Yeah.
you could much more safely make a 2% beer and dilute it when you want and adjust it.
Yes,
at
you
home.
could. Yeah.
Then you could make a non-alcoholic beer. The safety would be quite different.
I also, like, you know, when I had these questions when I was first doing it, I had to remind people that I was only making about 20 bottles, you know, so it's, you know, it wasn't, you know, it's not quite as big a thing, and I was pasteurizing with a dairy pasteurizer, you know, like the sink one, but that was, yeah, I mean, it's, the controls in place when I started. I wasn't selling it to anyone. It was just something we made for months and months and months. But yeah, it doesn't, anything that you would do on a small kit doesn't scale very well anyway. So certainly NA beer that's something we haven't covered, but scaling NA beer would take
nightmarish.
it was like, I genuinely, we put these hops in, and something horrible, it's like it fell down the middle of the tank, and I've never seen anything like it. It was the deadest fermentation I've ever seen. Just that everything sank, and it was like, but it's still producing CO2 somehow, and you just, these guys will back me up. When you work in NA, it's so much weirder and more unpredictable than craft beer, to the point where it's like, we may never work out what happened with that. It just did once.
I'd agree with that. We haven't figured out a way to scale NA, so we've almost given up on pilot scale stuff because it will be so different and usually worse. Like we've got it dialed in for our full production, but we have not figured out a way to mimic that on a small scale
Yeah,
and
that's the same for
anything
us.
representative.
When we were producing a pilot in Chicago on the smaller kit, we were just it's okay, it's good beer, but it's going to be easier and better on the bigger kit, so we just ended up putting it on the bigger kit. You have so big, variance of error, a much wider range of errors, like tolerance, and you have so much more control and then so many more eyes on.
It's also one reason I like to know our yeast, because if you're going to commit to a full-scale production, you want some idea of how it's going to behave. Whereas if you can pull it off on a small scale, you've got way more room to experiment, right? And try totally different things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Do we have any more questions out there in the chat? I know we've been trying to hit them, and and Kevin's been answering some in there where he can. Any other big questions before we wrap this up with some high-level takeaways from everybody as to what they think some of the biggest things to pay attention to on fermentation are? There is that question: can we conclude that NA is the quantum mechanics of brewing? It does. It does seem like there's some
there's a lot of spaghetti
science
in it,
does not perfectly describe it. Our current models are insufficient for explaining it.
I think it's pretty accurate.
I will say, I'll put my hand on heart. There's a couple of people that I've worked with that are maths on the table kind of guys, and if they can't make me an Excel spreadsheet that tells me how to do it more, then no one can in my circle of people I know. I'm not saying we couldn't employ, a Hawkins level mind to do this. I'm just saying, at the end of the day, we're still brewers. Like we're, not exactly rocket science, is it? It's more sort of microbiology.
Jordan, there's a question in here that comes back to watering back. We're not going to call it diluting. We're going to call it blending back.
Blending
to target. I mean,
blending to target.
Shaving back the ABV. We can.
Has my boss been on the phone to you?
We can come up with lots of creative ways to say this in a more attractive way.
What's the question?
When you're adding that water back, is there anything particular that you found, especially in the NA space, that helps make that more or less successful, or is that style dependent when you're doing that in terms of what that water chemistry is? And then is there something, I know if I'm thinking about it on a distilling side, there's certainly arguments about proofing versus slow proofing, and like slower water additions over time versus all at once water additions. Is there any kind of any science to this, that, or even any kind of practical addition process to whether you do it?
So we actually found that what we wanted to do was minimize interruption to the beer process, and that meant we would have to go right down to making sure that we weren't getting any oxygen ingress, and we weren't pumping anything. We weren't needlessly putting things under pressure or introducing things into the process, which at this point is almost, you're treating it as sterile. So we're kind of try and make sure that is, it's not going to be, but we're making sure we got the lowest bioburden possible. The water that goes into it has been reverse osmosis. It's been adjusted with water chemistry to make sure it's correct to go into the mix. And we may actually add other things at this point. It's a highly convenient point to add any kind of final liquid additions that may go in, and especially, this will be another good chance for what we would call like a hard QC point, where it's like it really has to be in the tolerance ranges now, because it's the last chance to ditch something before it becomes very expensive in cans and boxes. So we are using it's city water, reverse osmosis. Then the water chemistry's changed. And sometimes we've added things. We have in the past tried making something akin to a hop water, and then adding that in, because once again, it just felt too wrong, just adding water to beer again, even though we could do the same thing at another point. And it's purely a psychological endeavor at this point, and bro science, and homeopathy maybe. But
did that work? Did that work?
It bloody worked. I don't know why. Of course it worked.
The rest
Exactly
of us can the rest of us
exactly
can
the
laugh at
same.
this, because that was exactly the question, and you got to the answer without actually reading the question. So
Oh, really?
That was impressive. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I say is when you start a business yourself and you're there from day one, you tend to have seen so much stuff that someone can ask you a question. You go, yeah, I remember that happening to me. And you have an exact answer for it because you've done it. I know what happens when two of your trucks crash into each other in the snow and destroy all your stock. I know what happens when you put a spelling mistake on something that's a swear word by accident, you know. Ask me how. I've already done it.
Kevin, there's a question about the Fermentis NA yeast offering, what it is, and how to get started with it.
Yeah. So
That's your boss calling now.
yeah, I guess there's some promotional time here now. Our first release into the NA space was Saf Brew LA01, LA being low alcohol, 01 being our first. We are currently about to release LA02, and then we have a third option, but I don't know what it'll be called.
Can I suggest LA03?
Somebody in the yeast space already has that name.
Oh, it sounds great. These names, by the way, are one of the reasons I bought them. I just thought they were so exciting.
But yeah, so we'll have 3 options soon. Like I mentioned, the LA01 is POF positive. You're not going to have a terribly strong phenolic character from it, so don't think like really phenolic Hefeweizen Belgian beer type character, but you can pick it up depending on the beer.
I used it for 2 years in our beers, and no one said about
yeah.
it.
I mean,
I've
I've had some beers, like I remember RAR BSG made a porter for a CBC probably 2019, 2020, something like that. And it was a porter, and I had to talk on NA beer at 10 in the morning, and they brought in just a bucket of beer and put it right in front of me. And I was like, if I didn't know that this was non-alcoholic beer, I'd think that you're insulting me, but I'll have one, I suppose. But really, honestly, with that beer, if you hadn't told me that it was non-alcoholic, I would have believed it was alcoholic. It was a very good porter. But the other 2 that are coming or should be here soon are both POF negative, but they're also not, they're non-SAC for those 2 options.
Interesting. Well, let's wrap up with a high-level takeaway. Peter, if you had one piece of advice to give to brewers out there about or that are thinking about embarking on their own NA journey as it relates to fermentation, what would be your biggest piece of advice?
Don't trust anyone. Do some experiments. Choose one thing and just run with it for a while.
That's fair. Jordan, one takeaway from you.
Don't cheap out. Don't try and do too many things and cheap out. Not only is it going to be alcohol free, so we don't have to pay tax, we can also do this. And then everyone's eyes start looking at margins that like, no, don't do that. Treat the beer. Every time we've talked, these guys have talked, it's about using the right yeast for the right beer, the right ingredients for the right beer. So if you're trying to do that, then make sure that it's representative of the quality ingredients and the amount of investment that you would put into a fully leaded version of it. Then add a bit more because you're going to bloody have to.
Because this is craft, damn it. This is craft
damn it.
beer. Yeah.
If I wanted to sleep at night, if I wanted to be comfortable, I'd be making lager in Milwaukee.
All right, Kevin, what's your biggest takeaway for folks?
So, first of all, this is to anybody making alcoholic or non, always keep in mind balance. Because I think that that's one of the most off-putting things is when a beer is out of balance. And yes, I know IPAs, hazy IPAs, all these things that disagree with balance, but for an IPA, you have balance. The second thing is if you're looking to get into the NA space, remember a couple of things. First, it's a totally different process. And second, if you're going to talk about a sessionable beer, what's more sessionable than non-alcoholic beer? So that's the business side of me coming out saying, hey.
No, I get it. No, I had a theory where I say that basically people stopped drinking in my circle of friends because they couldn't have a pint at lunch anymore without HR being called. You can't blame us for that. We still wanted a pint at lunch. And then the old Black Mirror. I used to go home from work and no one phoned me about work. If someone phoned my home phone and started talking about work, I'd be like, you going on about? Like, ridiculous. Now it's the first thing you do, you come through the door and they give you a shiny Black Mirror, you know, and you're expected to work. I can't be sitting down the pub 6 pints deep on a Wednesday and my boss suddenly decides that the Henderson report needs to be done and I have to do a Zoom presentation to the board in 15 minutes and I'm standing there like a poet on payday swaying in the breeze. You know, that the world has changed, but pubs can't serve no one. And if you can have an NA pint or if you can have any kind of thing that HR won't call you about after lunch, then the pubs can open at lunch again.
Heck yeah, let's do it for the pubs. Well, just a note, we had some questions about processing and finishing, about things like pasteurization. Tomorrow's session is going to go deep into that. We have Jeremy Rudolph, former Oster Blues, now with Best Day. We have Chris O'Connor from Prost. And we have a rep from TechniBlend that also makes a membrane filtration unit. We're going to go deep into everything from food safety, stabilization, some of the chemical processes for those that aren't going into full. And we're also going to talk about, the full-on approach to filtering yeast or filtering alcohol out of finished beer, as well as multiple modes of pasteurization, flash pasteurization, tunnel pasteurization, because a lot of brewers are actually using pasteurization at multiple stages through this. We're going to talk about it from a lab perspective, hitting kill rates for microorganisms and what safety is, and we've got some solid lab experience behind this. And so we're going to pull all of that out in tomorrow's session. If you've had questions about that, tune in tomorrow for that. And thank you to our event sponsors for making this free deep dive possible. It's Abstrax Hops, Fermentis, TechniBlend, Crafted ERP, Oktober Can Steamers, and PakTech. Go to the event page on beerandbrewing.com for more about each of them, links to their websites and everything else. And thank you, Peter. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Kevin. Everyone in the chat, thanks you as well. It's been great talking to you about non-alcoholic fermentation. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.